In this deep dive into the Alpha Legion, we will cover everything we know about them, or at least what we think we know about them. Because with the Alpha Legion, everything could be true. Simultaneously, everything could be false. At one point, they were called the XXth Legion. This was during the early days of the Great Crusade, and the 20th Legion would eventually garner a much more infamous name, the Alpha Legion, and their story is one of contradiction and shadow, spanning millennia, of secrets buried deep beneath lies, and truth so tangled even the Emperor himself couldn't make heads or tails of it. Official records state that they were turned against the Imperium by Horus during the Horus Heresy, pledging their allegiance to chaos. Yet long before their fall, they were already legends of secrecy and operatives so cloaked in deception, matters of manipulation, and underhanded tactic that we could not even be sure if they actually turned. And perhaps the single most greatest secret of this legion is that they did not have one Primarch, but two, Alpharius and his twin, Omegon. Identical twins, not only in form, but in mind as well. Some claim that they were literally one soul split in two bodies. Others whispered that the entire legion's identity was built on that very twin deception from the onset. A duality of purpose that persists even now. However, there are those who posit that there is no official Alpha Legion anymore, that whatever they were has splintered so many times and folded in upon itself that it is beyond recognition. But then again, those same people are often the ones who tend to vanish before they can report anything new. And while that might seem like a coincidence, there are no coincidences when dealing with the Alpha Legion. Everything is circles within circles when dealing with them. Every last one of the Legion's veterans are specialists in infiltration, covert warfare, and deceit, as they have been trained to embed themselves for years, even decades or centuries, behind enemy lines, manipulating entire populations and pulling the strings of events without ever stepping into the light, as they can disguise themselves as almost anything in existence, since disguise are one of the more common things within the Alpha Legion, to the point that Alpha Legion operatives have masqueraded as individual loyalist Space Marines, entire squads, and there are even those who believe that there are current day loyalist chapters that are just expansive, interwoven Alpha Legion operatives who have been so immersed in their roles that they don't even realize that they are not the only ones who are disguised as loyalists. Amongst them move countless human agents, known only as operatives, who serve as spies, cult leaders, and saboteurs. Before even a single shot is fired, the Alpha Legion prepares the battlefield through extensive espionage and uncountable amounts of subversion, propaganda, cult manipulation, and targeted corruption in order to erode their enemies from within. By the time the Legion strikes, their foes have already been weakened by unrest, rebellion, and the whispering, gibbering promises of chaos. Even then, the Alpha Legion prefers that others bleed in their stead. Cultists, mercenaries, and unsuspecting pawns who never realize whose plans they truly serve. Their hallmark maneuver is also known as the harrowing, and it embodies every aspect of this philosophy, as it will be subtly followed by devastation that completely subsumes their enemies, as it begins with uprisings and sabotages, spreading confusion like wildfire. Then comes infiltration, surgically removing a world's command and control structures and replacing it with their own. And finally comes the killing blow, a coordinated, multi-pronged assault of a terrifying precision, one which would leave even the Raven Guard impressed. This is often led by their Terminators and their heavily armored Astartes operatives. The title of Harrow Master itself is one of immense prestige, reserved for those capable of orchestrating such an intricate destruction of their adversaries. Unlike many of their traitor brethren, the Alpha Legion rarely seeks refuge within the Eye of Terror, as they move through real space, avoiding the warp's distortion, allowing their gene seed to be remarkably pure. The question then lies, how can such a massed traitorous force remain active for 10,000 years after the heresy, as according to Inquisitor Craven, the Huntsman, the answer lies within the Imperium itself. The Alpha Legion recruits and augments new operatives from Imperial worlds, training them under the noses of their supposed enemies, at times training them within the structure of a loyalist chapter, not only gaining their knowledge, relics, and tactics, but also decades upon decades of training and connection. Amongst their specialized units are Seeker Squads, Leonin Terminators, and Efreet stealth teams, the latter of which were commanded by Omegon himself, and they would even go so far as to break the Mechanicus' belief structure by developing their own advanced technology in secret, including the first bolter rounds capable of piercing power armor, and even modified variants of Mark VI Corvus pattern power armor, which they would refer to as the Corvus Alpha suit. Then comes one of the things that sets them the most apart from any other Space Marine Legion: their use of chameleon technology, a device capable of altering both armor and flesh, allowing them to physically, quite literally, impersonate anyone, including but not limited to individuals from rival legions to a simple human clerk, and be physically and biologically that which they are impersonating. Because when it comes to the Alpha Legion, the only truth that remains certain is that nothing is ever certain. This is because when dealing with the Alpha Legion, the truth is a rather slippery thing, as every fact is actually closer to a rumor, and every rumor is a question. And when you think you've truly found the real story, the truth behind the fiction, you're only looking at what they wanted you to believe was real. Before the heresy, the Legion's methods were already unconventional and held in rather low regards, as most Space Marine Legions tested their recruits through individual trials of strength, will, and endurance. However, the Alpha Legion operated in a completely different manner. They tested entire squads and their ability to work together. Either the team succeeded as one, or the team failed together, as they believed solo heroics were a liability, not a virtue. And the Alpha Legion prioritized unity and teamwork, not the symbolic kind, but a real, functioning hive of purpose, as every soldier was a cell in a singular, calculating organism. Their very structure reflected that kind of thinking, as traditional ranks like companies and chapters were replaced by harrows, cohorts, hosts, and instruments, all which were designed to be ever-shifting formations that appeared and dissolved, then reformed as the situation demanded. Commanders were called harrow masters, and would only be appointed so long as their theater of war existed. Once a campaign ended, the structure they commanded and even themselves would vanish. Inside their councils, things were surprisingly democratic. Decisions weren't handed down from on high. Instead, everyone, even the Legion's human operatives, could speak freely during the planning sessions, as discussions ranged from strategy to philosophy, and even the implementation of imperial policy. These were topics that would have gotten most men silenced by their superiors elsewhere, even in the more generous legions such as the Blood Angels or the Ultramarines, and yes, that would even include the Salamanders. Later generations of recruits would then be chosen for their sharp minds, initiative, and their ability to question orders intelligently. This was a rarity even amongst the Emperor's Angels of Death. As an aside, they would probably respect Nasir Ahmed for his ability to question even the Emperor's decisions. Even then, their doctrine of identity was strange. To the Alpha Legion, they were a legion in its truest sense. Cut off the head and the body would still strike. When outsiders asked their names, every legionary would give the same answer: I am Alpharius. Even when several stood together, each would claim the same identity, a tactic that was designed to confuse both their allies and to terrify their enemies, as it wasn't just misdirection, it was an ingrained belief. To them, this went so far as to, when the loss of Alpharius occurred, the real one, whoever he was, nothing would truly change within the Legion's operational integrity. Alongside their Astartes operated Stragoti, or snowmen, human operatives who had been embedded within the imperial military and bureaucracy. They were agents who would be hidden in plain sight, like seeds in foreign soil, waiting for the merest hint of the signal to act. The one way to tell them apart was that each bore a small hydra tattoo in a place that would not normally be observable by most. This would be a silent mark of allegiance. If discovered, these operatives weren't abandoned. The Legion would risk entire missions and campaigns in order to recover or conceal them. And when that wasn't possible, the Alpha Legion had other ways of keeping their secrets buried permanently. After the Horus Heresy, whatever remained of the Legion dissolved into something else entirely. If there was ever a centralized Alpha Legion, that is. It most definitely hasn't existed for a very long time. The Hydra became their symbol, and this symbol became ever so prominent within the Legion, as it was a beast that fights on, no matter how many of its heads you sever. always pulling at multiple directions. And fittingly, the assassination of a supposed Legion commander has never slowed them. Every death simply births another head somewhere else. According to the fragmentary inquisitional records that were gathered by Inquisitor Craven, the modern Alpha Legion operates as countless independent cells scattered across the Imperium, each functioning autonomously embedded within cults, militias, and even imperial administrations. Destroy one cell and the others will continue undisturbed, untraceable, and yet somehow, despite all this chaos within their deception, they act with an eerie synchronicity that beguiles even the synchronicity of the ever-secretive Dark Angels. How do they coordinate? Officially, the Imperium has no idea, but rather they posit a simple answer, that they don't. The unofficial answer is far stranger. Some theorize that they maintain communications through their operatives, human intermediaries with specially developed psychohypnotic therapies designed to obey Legion commands in particular ways without hesitation or even memory of doing so. These agents supposedly exist fully within Imperial society, relaying orders and intelligence between these cells. The result is a decentralized intelligence network that functions without any form of visible leadership, or at least leadership that anyone can identify. This is a system that works disturbingly well, which might explain why every attempt by the Inquisition to uproot as much of it as possible ends up in silence or misdirection. It is important to understand that while fractured, the Legion can still unify when the price is worth the risk. If a target is tempting enough or a plan grand enough, multiple warbands will converge on a single Harrowmaster, forming a temporary but devastating coalition. One such example occurred in the darkest days of M42, when Harrowmaster Solomon Akura gathered a number of Alpha Legion splinter cells under one banner. His alliance included forces with names such as the Serpent's Teeth, the Guns of Freedom, the Shrouded Hand, the Penitent Sons, the Faceless, the Sons of Venom, the First Strike, the Rust Bloods, and together they nearly destabilized entire sectors of Imperial space. Even in their fractured state, they remain faithful to Alpharius' creed, one that amounts to the fact that every problem has multiple solutions, and every plan should unfold like a hydra's strike, swift, coordinated, and impossible to stop once begun. The most accomplished of their commanders bear the title of Masters of Division, experts in misdirection, illusion, and deceit above all others. This is the truth about the Alpha Legion to this day, or at least the truth that we are permitted to see, because the moment you think you figured them out, you start to wonder whether that's what they wanted all along, or if you, in fact, are Alpharius. Even amongst the traitors, their story remains one of falsehoods sealed behind 10,000 years of silence. But to gain a better understanding, we must start at the beginning, as the Alpha Legion, also known as the 20th Legion, was one of the Emperor's original 20 created legions, and the Legion itself would be one of the later born in the first founding. And unlike other legions, they were specifically made for subtlety, precision decapitating strikes, and misdirection. The Legion was designed not just to win wars, but to make their enemies forget that they lost them in the first place. Their ranks were made to blend within Astartes and mortal operatives by being slightly smaller than the norm. Warriors and infiltrators alike, each piece was made to be a part of an ever-shifting game, all set about the galactic chessboard. Their Primarch, or perhaps better stated as Primarchs, known as Alpharius and Omegon, together were called Alpharius Omegon, recognized as a singular entity rather than two beings, to the point that not even their brothers knew the truth, that they were two minds acting as one. The irony of this is, after their fight with Rogel Dorn, no one can say which of them lived and which of them died, or whether they even died in the first place, and it was all an illusion, where a lowly legionary took their place against Rogel Dorn during the heresy, allowing Alpharius Omegon to continue to operate behind the scenes. As previously stated, one supposedly fell to Rogel Dorn at Pluto during the Horus Heresy, the other said to have been slain later by Rabut Guilliman. And yet the Alpha Legion operatives have been reported centuries later, fitting the exact descriptions, mannerisms, and even forms of the Primarch, and whispering the name Alpharius in a manner distinct from the traditional "I am Alpharius," leading some within the Inquisition to believe that at least one of their Primarchs still walks amongst them. It is to the point that you might say that the Alpha Legion has a rather unique definition for killed in action. According to Imperial records, the Legion was the last to have been reunited with their Primarch, serving for a mere 20 Terran solar cycles, meaning that the Legion was so impacted by their Primarch merely a few scant years before the heresy erupted. Yet somehow we are led to believe that their style of warfare became infamous without the guiding principles of a Primarch. However, some scant records lead higher ups within the Inquisition to believe that Alpharius was truly the first Primarch found, raised by Malcador rather than the Emperor, in secret from the rest of the galaxy, making him the true first son of the Emperor, which would account for their higher than normal mannerisms resembling their Primarch than other legions, who were later discovered. And it would explain how their methodology of combat shifted so little despite having discovered their Primarch, as this was a rather infamous and identifiable method of warfare. Where other legions fought in glory and spectacle, or for a great moment of victory, the Alpha Legion fought for outcome. They struck from the shadows, dismantling armies before their enemies could even realize they were at war. They infiltrated, corrupted, and redirected entire planetary defense networks without ever revealing their hand. This would set them apart from even the Raven Guard, who, while choosing a similar aesthetic and general ideology for tactics, would indeed often have a large presence. However, their methods, they called this doctrine the long game. The art of war was to them measured not in battles won, but rather in narratives rewritten. They were just as, if not prouder, if a world that would have normally rebelled against the Imperium suddenly found itself as a part of it, never having even fired a single shot, even if it took significantly longer to persuade it subtly to join. However, their methods did not sit well with everyone. During the campaign on Dresda Prime, Alpharius executed a flawless conquest, manipulating, misleading, and dismantling the enemy so completely that the planet's defenders didn't even realize they had actually engaged in any form of combat before it was too late. The price was time and patience, something that even Rabut Guilliman of the Ultramarines found intolerable. He accused Alpharius of wasting resources and delaying victory. Alpharius' only response was the simple statement, "Too easy." In essence, pointing out that Rabut Guilliman's methods, while quick and easy, were rather blunt and unwieldy. And if there's one thing the Alpha Legion has never been accused of, is doing things the easy way. When the heresy itself had begun, their true allegiance became something rather complicated. At Isfahan 5, they arrived as loyalists in the second wave, only to turn their guns upon the Raven Guard, the Salamanders, and the Iron Hands. The massacre that followed was one of the most defining betrayals of the war. Yet beyond that moment, the Alpha Legion records fade into contradiction. Some accounts place them fighting the Space Wolves and the White Scars, while others suggest they were already pursuing their own secretive campaigns independent from Horus's Greater Rebellion. And even after the fall of the War Master at Terra, the Alpha Legion didn't flee into the Eye of Terror with the others. Instead, they slipped further east, continuing a series of shadow wars, not only against the Ultramarines, but strangely enough, against some fleeing members of Chaos and even Xenos. Their final reported engagement of that era would take place on the world known as Escador, where Guilliman faced Alpharius, or at least who we believe is Alpharius. Knowing the 20th Legion's reputation for psychological warfare, Guilliman deliberately broke from his own codified doctrines, adopting an unpredictable series of reckless tactics. For perhaps the first and only time in history, Alpharius was truly outplayed. Once again, at least who we believe is Alpharius, the two Primarchs would meet in battle, and Alpharius was surprisingly easily taken down, and his body burned upon a pyre as Guilliman looked on. But as with all things concerning the Alpha Legion, the story wouldn't end there. Moments after their supposed defeat, the Alpha Legion forces launched a series of counterattacks, precision strikes, and other attacks that necessitated the Ultramarines to be in those exact positions, crippling the Ultramarines' attachments and utterly erasing any illusion of victory, forcing Guilliman to concede the battle, withdrawing his forces and ordering an orbital bombardment to end it once and for all. Yet the Legion, surprisingly enough, still endured, their resources barely touched. As several Imperial scholars have noted, Escador itself seems to have been just another act within the grand misdirection, on a scale that only a Primarch like Alpharius could conceive of, leading many to ask, was the Primarch of the Alpha Legion truly slain, or is the death of Alpharius merely another layer in a vast deception, so vast that even Guilliman played an unknowing part in, as every time the Imperium has thought it finally struck the death nail, the Alpha Legion just returns from another direction, under another name, but with the same purpose, much like their sigil, the Hydra, as every head falls, is now replaced with two more. Before the treachery of Horus ever stained the stars, the 20th Legion was already a secret the galaxy wasn't meant to find. Before the Horus Heresy, before the fires of brotherhood and betrayal, there was the Ghost Legion, the 20th. Its formation, purpose, and even existence were intentionally cloaked by the Emperor in layers of imperial secrecy so dense that even the Emperor's own court couldn't see through them. This was in no small part, supposedly because of Malgador the Sigillite's own actions. However, some believe that it was the Emperor's design all along, a deliberate and intentional act of concealment. Many imperial historians now whisper that this veil of secrecy wasn't just a measure of protection, but rather the seeds of something darker. What had begun as prudence curdled into obsession, a legion bred for deception and infiltration, for subterfuge, and perhaps in time, to be both consumed and to consume all around them with those very talents. Once they were the Emperor's sharpest hidden blade, a veritable scalpel, but as Horus rose as a war master, that blade began to twist even in the wielder's hand. The Alpha Legion became something serpentine, a hydra both in form and function, its very identity splintered, its purpose devouring not only its enemies but itself, as they became a weapon that had no hand, one that not even the very gods of the Imperium could deign to control. Even the circumstances of their creation remains disputed, as the 20th Legion was amongst the last to be crafted in the gene laboratories beneath Terra's ash-choked skies in the very twilight days of the Unification Wars. While all legions were born under layers of secrecy, the 20th was enveloped in an extraordinary yet suspicious silence, a silence that even the Emperor's closest advisors were forbidden to question. This is to the point that they were grouped with the Salamanders and the Space Wolves, proto-legions, and even there the 20th was raised apart from its brothers. Each of these three was forged for a purpose, one which was rather specific and delicate that if exposed to the greater Imperium, it might jeopardize the great work itself. But while the Salamanders would emerge on the Paragon side of the spectrum, and the Space Wolves would be the loyal lapdogs of the Emperor, the 20th grew even more distant, less trusted than any of its kin. Where their peers marched to glory, the 20th became ghosts. Their early records are little more than scattered reports and redacted entries, sparse, suggestive, and overall deeply unsettling. There are mentions, just mentions, of unknown Astartes detachments carrying out surgical strikes on high-priority targets, abductions, assassinations, eliminations so clean that it is almost as if they never happened, and if not within these records, there would be no knowledge of them. These operations bore authorization seals from the highest levels, codes that brokered no challenge, even from other Imperial commanders, even from Primarchs. And then there's the matter of the ever so suspicious name, Alpha, which is a simple designation, but one that carried a strange amount of weight. The name itself was actually derived from the final stage of Gene Seed testing and the first deployment of Legion that was no longer in the experimental stages. Yet publicly the Alpha Legion and their use of Alpha was meant for being ready for war. Yet its hidden meaning and the reasons behind it were lost to time, as it seems the 20th Legion never proceeded past that phase. Each Legion undergoing the Alpha stages of Gene Seed testing underwent small staged inductions using rather restricted test groups in order to prepare for full-scale development. When the Alpha stage was reached, the Emperor would typically authorize mass recruitment, expanding the Proto-Legion into a full fighting force, but not with the 20th Legion. Records show that after their field tests, which by all surviving accounts were exemplary, beyond even the expectations held for the other legions, they were never approved for expansion. No recruitment zones, no Terran intake, no mass growth. The 20th Legion Legion was restricted to remain as a compact force, perhaps only a few thousand strong, while other legions became armadas of tens of thousands of Astartes. This was a deliberate isolation, but the question remains for many in the Imperium unanswered as why. Now, theories are rather numerous, as they have always been with anything that involves the Alpha Legion. The first is rather mundane: sabotage, as supposedly their recruitment network are believed to have been compromised for some reason, be it the best genetic stock had been already claimed by other legions. However, that quickly falls apart when viewing legions such as the 9th, the Revenant Legion, who would even adopt near abhuman, things that were so genetically far from humanity that under the presence of any other legion, they would have been purged. Then there's others who posit perhaps some forgotten catastrophe forced the Emperor's hand, wiping out their intake sources entirely, something similar to what occurred with the Emperor's children. However, there are other theories, ones whispered amongst fewer scholars, suggesting that there is a hidden flaw, something within the gene seed or in the men themselves. Yet this is difficult to reconcile with the data, as the 20th success rates were superlative, cleaner than even the Dark Angels and the Ultramarines gene lines, to the point that it makes the aberrations and the ability to implement the Canis helix of the Space Wolves come into question if that was the issue. Then there is another line of speculation, one which is rather chilling, that the Emperor created them in this way with a deliberate containment in mind. This theory posits that the Emperor wanted the 20th to be held apart, perhaps as a reserve of untainted genetic material, perhaps a control group, or even, as some custodians' personal archives suggest, as a testbed for something greater. There's even a handful of cryptic data fragments that hint that the Alpha Legion may have been a stepping stone towards the creation of the Grey Knights, or some similar hidden faction. That is, if we are to believe that the Grey Knights were intended to be created all along. By the year 798 M30, the Great Crusade had already been in full motion, when the Legion's gene-forged sons had set about across the vast stars in grand expeditionary fleets, binding the shattered fragments of humanity beneath the Imperial Aquila. Yet amidst the thunder of conquest and the blaze of triumph, one Legion, the 20th, for a while, simply vanished. For solar decades, their name utterly disappeared from record. Scores and scores of Imperial data slates did not even recognize their existence. Yet, there is no trace of them being destroyed or disbanded. Simply, they ceased to be within the record. Much like Enoch, they were not. Still, the void that they left behind would not remain silent. As whispers traced their shadows through the darkest corners of the Crusade, their operations seemingly so classified that even the Throne of Terra itself seemed to be fully unsure of who had given the orders, be it Malcador the Sigillite or the Emperor himself. Some within the uppermost echelons of the Imperium began to suspect that the 20th Legion, still leaderless and bereft of their Primarch, had been assigned a completely hidden purpose, their mission buried even beneath the Emperor's own bureaucracy. The running theory goes as follows. While the Great Crusade sought to unite humanity against the alien horrors and the ancient nightmares that had brought them down during the Age of Strife, the Emperor also feared an enemy within. And indeed, that danger was real, as insurrections, rebellions, along with the return of defeated warlords who once bled the soul of Terra dry, now feasted in the newborn Imperium's heart. Many of these figures, twisted by ambition or warped by contact with the immaterial, sought to twist the imperial truth itself into a weapon against its creator. Then came what some scholars call the incident, a silent crisis that reached the very genetic vaults of the Legion's Astartes, a corruption that almost destroyed the Third Legion permanently, those who would become the future Emperor's children. That event, dated roughly at 838 M30, was truly catastrophic, as their gene seed was tainted by an unidentified viral blight, nearly eradicating their line before it could truly begin. But alongside that disaster came strange reports, scattered accounts of Astartes detachments operating exceedingly far away from any known front, executing surgical strikes and assassinations, all without identifiable heraldry, records, or even recognition from Terra. They fought like Space Marines, they moved like Space Marines, but they bore no Legion markings, and they had no support vessels that could be recognized. Or worse, they bore and used the wrong ones, in combinations that did not make sense. In some instances, mysterious warriors appeared wearing the established colors and heraldry of legions such as the Iron Hands, the Luna Wolves, even the Ultramarines, only for the genuine articles to later discover that they had never sanctioned such deployments. These false flag operations seemed to function with a level of precision and care that left no witnesses and only scattered data fragments to bring about the truth. Everything from assassinations, data theft, sabotage, abduction of planetary officials, the recovery of artifacts of interest that were directly then stored within the vaults of Terra, all carried out by these faceless Astartes who vanished before reinforcements could ever arrive. Amongst the whispers that circulated the High Imperial Command, a name began to circulate for this faction. They would become known as the Ghost Legion. Publicly, no such force existed. Unofficially, that depends on who you ask, and whether you believe anything involving the Alpha Legion. Reports of the Ghost Legion were rare, or at least those that surfaced were rare. Governors who lodged formal protests saw their petitions vanish in administrative black holes. Officers who questioned these incursions found their orders quickly amended. And even more, the Legio Custodes, the Officio Assassinorum, and the Securitas Incancius rose to prominence, and the more prominent they became, the more the Ghost Legion faded into imperial myth. If the Ghost Legion ever truly coherently existed, and that is a big if, it represented a terrifying possibility. A legion of the Emperor's own superhuman creation, whose specialty was to act outside the laws of even the Emperor himself, within the shadows and outside the expectations of others. A legion that operated truly unseen, one that to be understood needed to have an individual look underneath the underneath. However, this was a question no one dared truly ask the Emperor. For over a century, it seems, the 20th Legion may have waged its own wars in the shadows, behind not just enemy lines, but the lines of the Imperium itself. A silent campaign fought beneath the noise of the Great Crusade, gathering knowledge, experience, and influence unseen by their brother legions. What became of them in those years, what they learned, remains a mystery, tangled in a web of lies, or perhaps more accurately, an unknowable conundrum, wrapped in an enigma. And with their reappearance, the question comes to mind. Did their purpose simply reach its conclusion, or were they superseded by new imperial intelligence organizations? Or had they grown too independent, too unpredictable, and too dangerous to be tolerated in such a manner any longer? Some scholars suggest that the Legion's time in the shadows only truly ended when their long-lost Primarch was finally discovered, at least officially. Others say they were never brought to heel at all. Whatever the truth, assuming the word truth applies here, the Legion stepped out of the dark and bore a new name, one that would come to haunt Imperial history, the Alpha Legion. By the late 880s of the 30th millennium, the Imperium was bleeding across thousands of fronts, but nowhere more severely than in the Rangdang Xenocide. These wars waged against an alien menace so vile that entire systems were quarantined from Imperial memory, threatened to unravel the Great Crusade itself. It was during the Third Xenocide, amidst the smoldering ruins of the Northern Imperium, that a figure stepped from the shadows and presented himself before Lionel Johnson, the Primarch of the Dark Angels. He claimed to be Alpharius. The man, or Astartes, depending on his stature, admitted that he himself was a Primarch of the 20th Legion, and he offered his assistance against the Rangdang nonetheless. The man, when questioned by Lionel Johnson, would be told that the Primarch of the 20th Legion had not been found yet. However, Alpharius, or the individual formally calling himself Alpharius, offered the Lion assistance against the Rangdang nonetheless, at one point even claiming that the 20th Legion favored Johnson as the future War Master of the Imperium. This would be a curious title that at the time did not yet fully exist, leading to speculation of this story being true or false, bringing about the question, why would this so-called Alpharius speak of a rank that had not been yet created? Why would the 20th Legion, unknown even to their brother legions, court a Primarch that they had never served under? Some suggest that this was a calculated overture, that the Primarch of the 20th was never found, or that it was a legion made with no Primarch in mind, and this was merely an Astartes playing the role for its legion. Others suggest this was a test to see which of the Emperor's sons would bend first to flattery, while others posit that it might have been a message meant for someone else entirely. Whatever the case, the Lion listened. Whether he accepted the offer was another matter entirely, as the Dark Angels would triumph against the Rangdang soon after this meeting, but at a cost that would nearly destroy him. Over 50,000 Battle Brothers were slain. However, the Rangdang were eradicated, yet the whispers of the 20th's involvement in this campaign persisted. If true, the victory might have been less of a triumph of the Lion's will and more of a demonstration of the Alpha Legion's first game in this galactic stage. Now the first official records of the Alpha Legion's emergence as a recognized force are predictably contradictory, where some Imperial archives date their debut preceding the Frontius extermination. Others pick the darkest day of the Third Rangdang Xenocide. This discrepancy is one of around 30 years, and it would make them the last legion to be formally acknowledged by the Emperor's war machine. Even their name seems to be a joke, potentially poking fun of the Dark Angels. The Alpha Legion, meaning first, supreme, primary. Said name could be seen as biting their thumb at the Dark Angels' claim to be the first legion. However, what is known is that they were the final legion to be recognized, and perhaps the last to be understood. Their chosen symbol, even during this, was the hydra, which embodied multiplicity, deception, and regeneration, much like what they would profess their tactics to be, where they would act like a serpent, coiled through the sacred geometries of the pre-imperial mechanism. Then of course comes Alpharius himself, the least known Primarch, if indeed he ever existed as a man, rather than an Astartes playing the role, seems to have few sources covering him. Reliable sources, which the Alpha Legion has made certain there are precious few, present multiple irreconcilable stories of his discovery. One tale circulated within the Imperial Court tells of a Luna Wolves battleship ambushed in an obscure system by a coalition of human worlds led by a cunning warlord. Horus, enraged by such a loss, pressured the enemy into a grueling gauntlet of traps until the supposed warlord infiltrated the vengeful spirit itself, cutting down the majority of Horus's Justerian Terminator elite before confronting the Primarch and eventual War Master directly. But rather than striking the killing blow, Horus recognized him as if by some buried instinct and declared him brother. The warlord would reveal himself to be Alpharius. Another account, extracted under psychic duress from a captured Alpha Legion centurion, claims that Alpharius was found on a nameless dead world amidst the Middragon stars, raised alone amongst the ruins, haunted by spectral predators. When Xenos corsairs arrived to plunder the world, the young Primarch slew them and took their vessel to seek his creator. Yet another version exists, sourced from the heretical text known as the Codex Hydra, spins an entirely different tale, one that states that Alpharius was a captive of the Xenos known as the Slough, and twisted into a living weapon until the Emperor himself stormed the fortress and freed his son. The final and rarer account, yet the most detailed one, seems stranger still. It states that Alpharius was never scattered at all, but rather grew beneath the Emperor's own watch under the direct guiding hand of Malcador the Sigillite, and he was to act as a hidden guardian and assassin kept in the shadows to safeguard his great work. Each story seemingly contradicts the others. Each insists upon its own authenticity, and yet each could be false or true, or even both, because with the Alpha Legion, the distinction between the truth and a falsehood was never the point. Following the Rangdang campaigns, the 20th Legion appeared intermittently in the records of the Great Crusade, often as allies of convenience, though perhaps the word ally is too generous for them. During the castigation of Trentus, a rogue imperial overlord turned against the Emperor after decades of loyal service. There, the Luna Wolves had led the assault alongside elements of the Night Lords, Iron Hands, and an unnamed contingent of Astartes, believed to be, but never confirmed, to have been the Alpha Legion. When Horus slew Trentus aboard his flagship, the rebellion collapsed, and the skull of the traitor was sent to Terra in mockery. Whether the Alpha Legion presence was ever sanctioned or even real remains unclear. Perhaps they were simply sent there to observe or to ensure that Trentus fell exactly at the right moment. Then there was the Surreptitious Purgation of 927 M30, a campaign against a Xeno strain said to have existed across dimensions. Records of the event itself are conspicuously absent, apparently intentionally erased. The only surviving notion mentions a sub-company of the 20th Legion being dispatched to investigate investigate these Xenos. However, all communications from the affected colonies ceased shortly thereafter. Whether they were silenced by these extra-dimensional Xenos or the Alpha Legion themselves remains an open question, one which is under beyond top secret classification indefinitely. When Alpharius was officially presented before the Emperor, the reunion, such as it was, lacked the warmth between a father and son. The records from Terra suggest that while their meeting was celebrated with all the grandeur and ceremony the Imperium could muster, the true interaction between the two was distant, formal, even businesslike, almost as if the Emperor had long interacted with Alpharius. However, others suggest that instead of this, the Emperor, having only one master, Priorities, at that time had an entire galaxy to govern and a crusade to lead, leaving little time for sentiment. Alpharius, for his part, seemed to understand. What little time they shared together remains mostly left to speculation. Some within the Legion later whispered that there was more to this reunion than meets the eye, that Alpharius was not one, but two, and that he had already fought the Emperor's shadow, Constantine Valdor, years before this. Indeed, those who have studied the 20th Legion closely, or claim to, often spoke of the names Alpharius and Omegon, twin primarchs, so alike even the Emperor's sight was said to have blurred between them. Whether this was a deliberate creation or some anomaly of fate, potentially even a primarch ability, which all are said to have at least one, none can be sure of. It seems the two of them acted as one mind split between two physical forms, a shared soul divided by the needs of strategy. To the outside world, there was only Alpharius. Omegon remained in the shadows, an echo behind the voice, even to their siblings. The Emperor, it seems, was aware of this truth and chose silence, even during the heresy. After all, when one's goals are as vast as uniting the stars, a secret or two must be considered a rather useful weapon. Only the Alpha Legion knew of this duality, and they guarded this information as fiercely as any fortress or fortification. Under their twin command, the Legion took form, becoming a reflection of their Primarch, as sharp, analytical, and impossibly disciplined as their gene-sire. They fought not for glory, but for results. Every operation was executed with impeccable precision and terrifying unity. To the Alpha Legion, individuality was secondary to the mission. The whole was a weapon, not the man. And in battle, they were a sight to behold. Their coordination bordered on the preternatural, squads moving as though they were guided by a singular will, their assault unfolding with a cold inevitability. But even as they fought alongside their brother legions, they kept a measured distance. The Alpha Legion smiled little, joked less, and revealed nothing to their allies, to the point that many of them found it utterly disquieting, unnerving even, as if fighting beside a reflection that could vanish the moment you blink. A living mirage, if you will. Some wondered if beneath this efficiency there lied something else. Contempt, perhaps, or a quiet amusement at how easily others believed what they were meant to see. The next well-recorded event involving the Alpha Legion, and amongst the earliest of the verifiable campaigns, lies with the Xenocide of the Akahera. This was a race of Xenos known to frontier colonists by a far more gruesome name. These were the Bone Drinkers, parasitic organisms that lived in conjoined masses of gestalt fungal flesh, forming a sentient mass that fed upon the marrow of living prey, and they seemed to prefer humans above all else. Initially believed to have been wiped out by the Lone Wolves during earlier Crusade operations, the Ahamkara returned decades later, preying upon isolated worlds in the western Segmentum Solar. When word reached Terra that an old horror had stirred once more, it was Alpharius that answered the call. The campaign that followed was a study in methodical eradication. The Alpha Legion divided its fleet into smaller hunter-killer wings, each moving with eerie precision without direct communication through the void to corner the fleeing swarms. They anticipated every migration pattern, every attempt at concealment. Where the Ahamkara infested abandoned space hulks, the Legion descended in silent boarding actions. Where they found nests buried with human colonists, they unleashed orbital fire until the air itself burned into inexistence. But what made the campaign infamous wasn't the ruthlessness of the Alpha Legion, but rather their cunning. Alpharius uncovered that many of these hidden nests survived through human collaboration. Cults and governors who had betrayed safety in exchange for the blood of their subjects. Rather than purge these traitors outright, the Alpha Legion used them, infiltrated their very network, and fed them misinformation, luring the largest marrow blooms into carefully orchestrated traps. When the killing was done, some of those collaborators met their end by the sword, by toxin, or by a gentle nudge of their planet's tectonic plate. When victory was all but secured, Alpharius chose to end the war in the only way he could. Working with the Magos biologists of the Mechanicum, the Legion engineered a phage, a viral poison that was harmless to most humans, but utterly lethal, and tailored perfectly to the Ahankura's biology, in a way that no adaptation and no change, other than a key aberration that would essentially label them as a completely different species, down to the last molecule, could overcome. The Legion released it upon the very worlds the Xenos had once fed from, ensuring that any surviving bone drinker would perish the next time it fed. The cost, well, that was generations of humans carrying the dormant strain, their bodies turned into silent weapons without their consent. Alpharius had, in effect, poisoned the Ahankuran's food supply, infecting mankind itself, while not necessarily directly striking out. This was cold, effective, and unsettlingly poetic. There are other records of their activity, but these have far less information. These include the compliance of 529, where details remain scarce, but surviving accounts describe the Alpha Legion's campaign against an unknown foe designated 529. Records would later be sealed or destroyed, though whether this was by bureaucratic order or by the Legion's own hand remains but merely a guess. Then there was the compliance of Freeness World, conducted alongside the Geno 760th Sparkoid, which was known to be one of the finest regiments of Imperial Army and hardened veterans by any standard. It seems that their activities upon this world were unsettling to even these legendary human veterans, even their Astartes allies, claiming that the Alpha Legion seemed to already know the outcome of every engagement and every move made by their adversaries. There is also the compliance of Thorium Abompex, a joint operation between the Death Guard and the Alpha Legion, and it is notable for no surviving record other than records stating that it occurred, surviving, and claims of biomes within the area of this engagement, for some reason, being erased rather than conquered, due to inconsistencies between galactic maps before this incident and afterward. In every campaign, one thing would remain consistent. It was the ability of the Alpha Legion to turn itself into a riddle, with each victory only raising more questions. Who gave the order? Who had truly guided the hand that struck? And of course, what at the time would be considered the Legion's motto, one which was whispered by those who encountered them: there is no Alpha Legion.